Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute. This is ArtNet News' new micro-podcast hosted by Margaret Kerrigan, who's the site's news editor Europe. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news expertly compiled by the ArtNet Pro editorial team.
The way that artists responded to the AIDS crisis in New York, in particular in the 80s and 90s, and how that changed public perception and ultimately then policy. And so we're working to apply that same principle to the climate crisis.
I'm Margaret Kerrigan, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast by ArtNet News. There's no denying that we live in an era of crisis, from geopolitical strife to economic squeezes and widening wealth disparity. Looming behind all of that is the ecological devastation brought on by climate change. All of these challenges have had an impact on the art market and the wider cultural sector writ large. Artists, galleries, museums, and cultural policymakers are all looking for ways to respond to these issues and change the way the art world works to foster a brighter and more sustainable future. Speaking of sustainability, it's perhaps worth noting that in the same time that awareness of the global climate emergency has grown over the last 2 decades, so too has the art market, which has swelled to an annual turnover of $65 billion in revenue. This has been fueled in part by the ever higher prices for art as the global high net worth population has grown, but also a proliferation of galleries, fairs, and events, all of which have contributed to a year-round travel schedule for collectors, curators, dealers, advisors, journalists, and everyone in between. Victoria Siddall is one of the figures at the forefront of a push for change within the industry. After a nearly 20-year career at Frieze, where she helped grow the fair into the global platform it is today, she is now the founding director of Murmur, a charity launched earlier this year that is aimed at helping the art and music industries combat climate change by funding initiatives to decarbonize, empower artists to create major societal change, and financing transformative climate work. She is also the co-founder and trustee of the Gallery Climate Coalition and continues on with Frieze as a non-executive director, while also working with museums and art environmental organizations on strategy, advocacy, and fundraising. There is perhaps no better place to broach the question of the art world's responsibility to climate initiatives than in Venice, a bastion of art, architecture, and culture that is especially vulnerable to rising sea levels. That's where this year's Art for Tomorrow conference took place, at which Siddall spoke about how both museums and the market must take steps to offset their carbon footprint. Additionally, she spoke to us about how the fair landscape has changed over the last 20 years, as have galleries' needs, and whether the growth of the market side of the industry has changed the way we view cultural value in the art world. Victoria, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us.
Thanks for having me.
So, we obviously know you from being involved with Frieze for the better part of 2 decades, and you really helped grow that fair into the platform that it has become today. What would you say are some of the biggest shifts that you've witnessed in the fair landscape and the wider market within the time that you were with Frieze and beyond?
I think one of the things that I've observed is when I started out at Frieze, which was in 2004, a long time ago, the notion of what a gallery was, which was a space, usually just in one city, where artists would be represented, art would be shown and sold, has radically expanded in that time. And the difference now between the galleries operating at that model and the galleries operating on a huge global scale, bringing in kind of hospitality, generating new audiences, the kind of reach that they have feels very different. But I will say also a really interesting change and a positive one in terms of bringing new audiences to art. And the benefit of that, I hope, is felt across the whole ecosystem, because ultimately, the more people who come to art and are passionate about it, if they have the means, the hope, of course, is that they go on to support artists and also nonprofits and museums, and that the ecosystem thrives as a result.
I think that's really interesting about the note that galleries have essentially really shifted into more of would you call it a professionalization of the gallery sector in some way? And was that something that galleries started doing just as the art market grew, or is that something that was also the result of the exponential proliferation of fairs since something like Frieze began?
Professionalization is a good word. And I feel like perhaps in the early days of Frieze, there was more of a kind of acceptance of a kind of scrappiness of like, let's do this, let's put on an art fair in a park. And, like maybe the roof leaked sometimes and maybe the walls were not quite straight. And that was sort of okay. And we've definitely reached a point where the expectations of the way art is presented at a certain level are much higher. It's kind of great in some ways that everyone's had to kind of rise to that occasion. I do think that kind of scrappiness and experimentalization does still exist. It's been great to see in London, like new young galleries still opening all the time in sandwich shops and like it's sort of innovating through finding spaces and showing artists' work in them. So that's definitely still there. I guess the point I'm making more is about like the difference between that younger, more experimental, small scale gallery and the big international gallery. I guess that range has grown enormously.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And I think it's interesting that you bring up the kind of wealth of smaller galleries that have been popping up in London over the last couple of years. I think you're mentioning, is it Ginny on Frederick, the one that opened
Yes.
in a sandwich shop, which is a brilliant idea. And they've since moved, which is great. They get a little more space. But I think London specifically is going through some growing pains, or maybe not growing pains, contraction pains. Like it seems to be a scene that is really in flux right now, especially post-Brexit, post-pandemic. Like you said, there's been a real growth of a lot of galleries, but what are some of the challenges facing not just the trade, but also just like creativity and art making in general in London, which is fairly embattled due to just kind of like a disadvantageous business environment?
I think one of the main issues that London has at the moment is a communications problem, because honestly, I live in London and it doesn't feel changed in so many ways. Yes, Brexit was, a mistake in my view, and it's certainly in terms of cultural creativity and the arts and arguably the economy, and COVID didn't help anybody anywhere in the world. But London feels vibrant and exciting. It's still a city that is full of artists. It still has great art schools. As we mentioned, there are young galleries opening all the time in London and kind of innovating and adding that vibrancy to the scene constantly. I think Brexit definitely didn't help us in terms of perception from outside. And that's something we have to work to counteract. And, the sort of self-deprecating nature of the British doesn't exactly help in that endeavor. But really, in terms of the kind of vibrancy of the atmosphere, the range of art that is on show in London at any given time, the fact that we still have free access to some of the best museums in the world and that they're there for anybody to come into at any time, I still find quite extraordinary. I think there's also, while we're on London, I have a lot to say about this subject, but, if we take the market into account as well, at the last measure, the UK art market was valued at, I think, $12 billion, second only to the US. And the art market in the UK is still bigger than the entire rest of the EU put together. So I think a lot of the media narrative around sort of London being, sort of on the, as you say, kind of disadvantaged position is not entirely accurate. It definitely doesn't feel that way. And the numbers speak for themselves as well. The other interesting thing about the UK right now is that we have an election coming up, as I'm sure you've heard. And unlike many countries in the world, the UK is looking as though it will very likely go left and elect a Labour government, who have also committed to increase art education in schools, which is great news, and seem to be taking the cultural sector and creativity generally very seriously. So there's a lot of hope there as well.
Yeah, it is a breath of fresh air after, more than a decade of conservative policies. I've seen a lot of public funding for art programs, art institutions in the UK stripped away or down to bare bones. And I wonder, is there anything specific policy-wise that you are interested in seeing more of once the general election goes through, and what can we hope for?
I mean, as I said, art education is one of the biggest things, because making art accessible to children at an early age and making that across the board for everybody is the only way we're going to really kind of diversify the sector and ensure that the UK, and this applies to any country, frankly, nurtures the next generation of artists. And when I say artists, I mean in the arts more broadly. They could be dancers or choreographers, they could be musicians, they could be, theatre directors or visual artists. And I think making that feel like something that's there for everybody, and making it clear that that is a great option as a way to spend your life, and that whatever socioeconomic background you're from, that's accessible to you, is incredibly important, not just for equality, but also just for the cultural future of a nation.
I wanted to go back to what you were saying about the perception issue around London too, because I think that's an interesting touch point. And, obviously, as being part of the media, I am contributing to this in some ways. But I do think it's interesting to note, like you said, the UK art market still remains incredibly large compared to the EU as a whole. I think the latest Art Basel and UBS report noted that it did slip behind China in 2023, but also China had like a record number of sales after kind of like a backlog of events not going ahead in 2022 due to pandemic restrictions. So all that being said, I think this issue of perception, especially focused on the market itself rather than the broader landscape of what else is going on in London, is a key thing to come back to. Regarding perception, though, I wonder how much in general, not just within the UK, our perception of value has changed based on kind of the growth of the market and how outsized that has become within the conversation around art and what it means to society over the last several years, really since the beginning of this century. And, we're here at the Art for Tomorrow conference in Venice, where you spoke on a panel about the market and its potential effect on visual culture. And I wonder if you could kind of talk me through what your thoughts on that are, and like whether we've reached an inflection point where the monetary value of a work influences opinions on its cultural value rather than the other way around.
I think if you asked any artist what their ambition was early in their career, what they care most about, what their legacy could be, I seriously doubt their answer would be selling for millions of dollars in an auction. I suspect it would be having a solo show at Tate or at MoMA. That feels like the pinnacle, really, of artistic achievement in many ways. And I think there's the idea that the market is the kind of arbiter or driving what we regard as good or bad. I personally completely disagree with. I don't see that as a, in the sort of reality, looking at the whole ecosystem and sector. But I do think, back to the media, and no personal criticism intended, of course, I understand why things like auction results make great headlines. If one auction is sort of 20% down on the same auction the last year, that becomes a big story. But in a sense, it's like a tiny, tiny part of the whole art world, the whole art sector, what people are talking about, thinking about, the artworks that are being made. The fact that around the world there are thousands of galleries showing and selling works by artists, not for millions of dollars, but for, much more modest amounts, but they're essentially sustaining those artists' careers and putting on great exhibitions that are free to access. And I think it's rare to see a piece that takes into account that whole ecosystem and how one thing supports another. One of the things I was talking about, for example, on the panel you mentioned, was kind of symbiosis within the industry and how all the different aspects of it support each other, ultimately underpin art and the artist.
Could you give us an example of what symbiosis looks like?
Well, this is an example on a very kind of micro scale, but I chair the board of Studio Voltaire in London, actually just for one more month, because I've been on the board for 12 years. But it's an extraordinary place, a non-profit and artist studio building. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary this week. And one of the things we were reflecting on was what Studio Voltaire had been able to do for artists. Within that, there was a beautiful example of symbiosis, where you have a big luxury brand, Loewe, who sponsor a studio program at Studio Voltaire that enables artists who do not have the financial means to live and work in London to have a free studio space and bursary and professional support. Now, one of the artists who was given a studio as part of this program in the first round is called Nena Kalu. And she was given this studio, was able to kind of live and work in London thanks to the Loewe Award. And the Tate have just bought one of her works. And I think it's the first time they've bought a work by an artist with a learning disability. And she's also got gallery representation. And actually her show at Arcadia Missa in London is just closing. And I just thought this is a combination of a big luxury brand, a small nonprofit, a world-class museum, and a commercial gallery, all kind of contributing to elevating this artist's career, who's a great artist, and kind of enabling her to continue doing what she does best. Yeah, I love stories like that.
That is a great story. And it was a great show. I was able to pop into it really briefly. And I also wonder, off the back of this kind of, what you said, having a corporate sponsor, there's been a lot of chatter about that in the art world in general over the last, decade or so, as a lot of luxury and other corporate brands get involved, and they may have already been involved in sponsorship in a lot of ways of art institutions and art initiatives. However, they become a lot more visible. Do you think that the concern around the kind of control that a corporate sponsor might exert on creativity and art making is warranted?
I think that's really up to the institution that's receiving the funds to ensure that the art is coming first. And obviously, in an ideal world, there's a great art project and somebody sees the brilliance of it and wants to fund it. But I would also say that this is not an easy landscape for museums and nonprofits. I mentioned Studio Voltaire. Public funding makes up 4% of Studio Voltaire's income. So that's 96% that has to be raised. And I know that similarly across the landscape for the bigger museums as well, they have to innovate and collaborate and look at different forms of funding. And sponsorship is an important part of that. And I think the best sponsors have that kind of understanding and attitude and awareness that the art needs to come first, and that will reflect well on them. And they're going to look good if they're doing something that's really meaningful and really contributing to the landscape and really supporting art and artists in a meaningful way. And I think we're seeing more and more of that. And I think there's also an interest, certainly from some artists, in actually collaborating with luxury brands in an interesting way. Another great example of that is the Chanel Art and Culture Fund, who have supported various institutions, but including the National Portrait Gallery in London, which reopened this spectacular kind of rehang of the collection last year. I'm also a trustee of the MPG, I should full disclosure. But really what their funding enabled was this kind of rebalancing of the collection and putting on display and collecting a lot more works of female sitters. The works that are on display at the MPG now are pretty much 50-50 balanced in terms of gender, which is a huge step forward.
We've seen a lot of positive change, I think, in the way that institutions and even the market is reevaluating historically overlooked artists, excluded artists, and beyond that, there's a larger conversation happening now about necessary change that will keep the art world sustainable going forward, which is a huge issue. And I think you specifically can speak to it in a really unique way, especially because you've been involved with so many programs, institutions, and also just a long history with fairs, which have contributed substantially in some ways to, world travel and kind of people hopping around from place to place, country to country over the course of the year, which has a big carbon footprint it left in its wake. So you've recently helped launch a new initiative called Murmur, which kind of is aimed at helping the art and music industries take accountability for the impact that they are having on wider ecological systems. Can you tell me a little bit about what prompted you to get involved with that and start that and how it works?
And you're right that actually the last few years have seen huge change across the world, generally sort of positive changes in terms of diversity and inclusion, awareness of the climate crisis and action on that. And of course, our sector has to respond to that, and in many cases does, which is great. You mentioned Murmur, which we launched a couple of months ago, and it's a charity essentially, but it is an initiative for the art and music industries, kind of a viable alternative to offsetting. Offsetting is kind of problematic for lots of reasons, but that doesn't mean that companies shouldn't be putting funds into the most impactful environmental solutions, both within their industries and in the wider world. And Murmur is very much set up to allow for that. So we've been speaking to the most progressive kind of art and music businesses and asking them, once they've measured their carbon impact and committed to reduce it, and those two steps are really vital, that they then make an annual financial contribution to Murmur's shared charitable fund. And we have expert advisory boards who are granting that money out, both to industry solutions, and we're convening the art and music industries to find those solutions and then make them happen. Also, the most effective climate organizations and charities who are really tackling the climate crisis on the front line. And then the third part of this is working with artists and musicians directly to give them the knowledge and the confidence to talk about this and to kind of use their special power to create change across society in terms of behavior, which will ultimately lead to change in policy. And we've seen the power of the arts broadly across history. We've seen the impact of music in the civil rights movement, for example, or the way that artists responded to the AIDS crisis in New York, in particular in the 80s and 90s, and how that changed public perception and ultimately then policy. And so we're working to apply that same principle to the climate crisis and take that special power that our sector has that's really quite unique and use it to create positive change. But in order to do that, in order for art to have that power, as an industry, we need to have our house in order. We need to be doing the work. We need to show we take this seriously. We need to be making positive changes. And actually, I came to this through Gallery Climate Coalition, which was founded by a group of people in London in 2020 and now has over 1,100 members in 40 countries worldwide who have all committed to a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 in line with the UN Paris Agreement. And that includes major museums all over the world, artists, galleries, big art businesses like Frieze and Basel and Christie's and Sotheby's. And they're all signed up to this industry goal. So our challenge now is to sort of like lead everybody towards it. And it's not easy to change an industry, honestly, but I feel that the will is there. The understanding is there now that we need to do something about this. There are artists who are really passionate about this and willing to get behind it. So it's happening.
I have maybe some technical questions around this too, because I think when we talk about the climate crisis and initiatives to address it, not just within the art sector, in all sectors, it's really easy to speak about it on a high level and to feel almost like self-satisfied in some ways. They're like, yes, we're paying attention to it and we're going to do something. And I wonder what kind of benchmarks are you enforcing, or those that are working with Murmur, how do they have to kind of show their receipts for what they're doing in order to remain a part of it? Is there like a 5-year plan for them, or what does that look like?
The benchmark to entry is having done a carbon audit and publicly committed to reducing their emissions. We're not set up to be actually checking every detail and making sure that that's correct. But this is also about a kind of spirit of commitment to this issue and also committing significant financial funds to this issue. So it does tend to be people who are taking this seriously and are really willing to get behind it. But the purpose, as I've said, one of the drivers of this is to remove the barriers that are preventing the industry to make these changes and convening these groups of people to discuss those barriers and figure out how to finance the solutions to them. So we've already started bringing together groups of people from the industry, mainly made up of the people who are contributing the funds, which is galleries, art fairs. We've invited someone in from a museum as well to give their perspective. And we've been delving into like, okay, these are the challenges and how could we envisage a world in which we've removed those? And then how can we use these funds to make that happen? So it's also about looking ahead. What do we want the industry to look like in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, and working our way back from that?
Is there specific barriers that keep coming up when you speak to the members that they're all kind of identifying?
From the commercial gallery carbon audits that we've seen, air freight, air shipping is a huge contributing factor. And there are alternatives to that. Sea freight is sort of 90% less carbon emissions than air freight. Truck shipping within the US or within Europe is also a good option. I'm not naive. I worked in this sector for many years on an art fair. I know that it's not always possible. So those questions are like, what are the issues there? Is it around insurance? In which case, can we help to solve that problem? Is it around the safety of work? Is it around the time it takes? Is it around artist deadlines? And then how do we bring the artists on board with that? It's trying to figure out how we make these things possible. It's not about telling businesses that they have to change overnight, or they have to stop doing things, or the small galleries that they're not allowed to grow to be big galleries. That would not be fair or reasonable. It's really about trying to make this possible for the whole sector in a collaborative way and in a way that everybody can raise up together rather than pointing fingers.
Yeah, it sounds like a project management kind of initiative in that way, that, like you said, there you're kind of pointing to the ways that just very mundane things get done, and that is where we actually need to be focusing our energy.
Totally. It could be around, it's not the biggest contributor to the climate crisis, but single-use packaging in the art world, for example, in terms of wrapping artworks. There are new products on the market that are kind of multi-use. Many galleries are using them anyway. How do we make that the norm? There are lots of interesting aspects in the mix. For example, the temperatures at which museums are asked to maintain the rooms showing artworks. The Getty Conservation Institute has just published a new piece of research into this, showing that those guidelines, and apologies, this is getting really technical, but the guidelines saying the temperatures and humidity levels that artworks need to be kept were actually written in the 1960s in London by a conservator at the National Gallery. So this was the 60s, before we had these concerns about climate, before we knew what we know now. And they were also written in London. So how do you apply those rules to the global south and Asia and the Middle East? Everything needs refreshing, but the only way these changes can happen is through collaboration across the entire industry. And I feel like that's my background in running fairs, dealing with hundreds of galleries, museums in cities all over the world, collectors as well, has sort of equipped me quite well to be having these sort of industry-wide conversations.
I don't think that's too technical at all, at least not from my perspective, because I feel like that's the kind of stuff that really gets my brain ticking about like, oh, like what do we just take for granted, essentially, that we don't even know what we should be looking at in some ways. Has that research panned out? Like, is there a differential of specific temperature that we can cite? Or is it just different per region or per artwork?
I think it's per artwork type as well. Yes, there will be works on paper that are very fragile, that need to be kept in certain temperatures and humidities and so on. But that doesn't necessarily then apply to sculptures that are made of marble. But for museums, I should say, I've seen museum carbon audits that show that 80% of their emissions are coming from the energy they use to heat and cool their building. So this is very pertinent and could make significant change across the museum sector if everyone can agree that those temperatures can be somewhat relaxed. It also, I mentioned the Global South. I think it's unfair to suggest that museums in parts of the world where they cannot meet those standards shouldn't be able to have an exhibition of a certain type of art because of their AC. I'm sure there are conservators who are like shouting at their computer listening to this right now, but it's a conversation and it's an important one to have. But as I said, something like that can only change if it's a joined up conversation across all parties.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to that end, are institutions kind of at the forefront of this? You said you're working with a lot of galleries. How are galleries adapting their models, and what kind of questions they have that are very different from an institution per se?
So institutions are, as you would expect, leading the way in this conversation. They're often public bodies that run by people who are very sort of thoughtful and very concerned about these sort of global issues. And if you take a museum like Tate, they've actually been very progressive in terms of addressing this issue, hosting events for other museums to talk about it. The Arts Council funding in the UK actually requires that any organisation receiving Arts Council funding is doing a carbon audit and has a pathway to carbon reduction. So certainly in the public sector, we're seeing significant progress and kind of understanding of these issues and a sort of willingness to address them. Gallery Climate Coalition was originally founded for the commercial sector. It's obviously now gone way beyond that. But we founded it for the commercial sector because there weren't resources for commercial galleries. And many commercial galleries are small organizations with teams of people under 10 employees, for example, and they don't necessarily have the resources to be working all these things out themselves. So we wanted to make that resource freely available, essentially. So yes, I would say institutions, and in the US as well. I know there's a network of New York museums who now meet regularly to discuss these issues. People who've signed up to GCC in New York include MoMA, the Guggenheim, Whitney New Museum, and so on. It's a very active conversation. The commercial art world is obviously something that's very fast-paced, and it's maybe trickier to kind of make change quickly, but we're getting there. I feel very hopeful.
Speaking of the commercial art world, because as we've been talking about this, I've been thinking about my own travel that I have to do for fairs. And, as an individual, it weighs on one quite heavily. It's a much more structural problem, and larger institutions and corporations need to take more accountability, which is exactly what you're trying to do. But as individuals, often, you feel like, oh, I'm so complicit in this because I, too, am hopping on this plane to Basel and, whatever. But I also wonder, because, we've seen so many stories about the emissions of Taylor Swift's private plane and how that stacks up versus like the average person. And obviously we have a lot of high net worth individuals within the art world who are often traveling, usually for commercial purposes, but not only, to different fairs, to different galleries. This might be a very cheeky question, but how do we kind of get individuals, especially those individuals who would have a higher carbon footprint, on side with this? And how do we kind of change the mechanics of the marketplace to facilitate that?
To come back to a point I made earlier, I do believe that we're all in this industry because of art and artists, and there is a real power there. John Comfort spoke yesterday and answered a question on this topic. And he was like, you can't put it on artists to change the world. It's not fair. That's true. But he also made the point that art isn't there to change the world, but art can change how people feel. And if you can change how people feel, then you can change the way that people act, and people can change the world. I guess that's the effect that, as I said, the arts more broadly, including art, music, and so on, can have on people. The people who buy art, the people who show art, all of us in this industry are here because we believe in artists and we love art. And there is a power there. And so I think artists really can be hugely influential in this conversation.
I think the note of hope is a perfect place to end this conversation. But thank you so much for, again, taking the time out of your schedule and sharing your really wonderful insights on where we're at and where we can go from here.
Thanks for having me. It was great talking to you.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.